In the latest episode of The First Lady, we start to focus on the marital issues that came even before each First Lady's husband became president, which ranges from money issues to infidelity and sometimes just not being there as much as they need them to be. To start off, we got to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, who discovered that her husband Franklin Roosevelt, because apparently he was lonely, he decided to have an affair with Eleanor's secretary named Lucy. Apparently, everybody knew. There, Sarah knew, who is Franklin's mother. Um, what's his name? Louis knew. It was a hot ass mess, and with that, Eleanor wanted to get a divorce, but the problem with that is she lived the high life for most of her life. So, with Sarah hearing of this, she decides, you know what? You do that, I'm cutting not only you off, I'm cutting Franklin off to really like sweeten the deal in terms of keeping them together. So, with neither one of them want to get cut off, for her own sake, Eleanor decides, you know what, we're going to stay married, but we're not going to be married in a sexual way. We'll be married as partners, potentially as friends, but right now, you are definitely on my list. But in time, especially as Eleanor starts to get part of the women's movement and really starts to rediscover who she is and what it means to be a Roosevelt, she eventually forgives Franklin. And I would say, based off what we saw in episode one, while Sarah kind of softens her belief that her son's going to really become something once he gets polio, you can see that by the time he ran for president, all old wounds were healed, and she decided, now I'm going to step in where your mother refuses to. And it kind of makes it a bit more heartbreaking the fact that once they got to the White House with, Eleanor believing in him for so long, he decides to betray her again. Going into Michelle's plot this episode, we focus on just the issue of Barack being a state senator, so not senator for the state, as in he went off to Washington, but interstate senator, and him not really making all that much money while Michelle is. Yet also, she's not just making more money; she's also still doing a lot of the housework, it seems, and raising the kids. This causes some issues between them, but with Sasha getting a bacterial infection and having to go to the same hospital that Michelle's dad was dying in, that kind of sets aside a lot of their marital issues. It makes it so that Sasha's well-being and also the issues of that hospital becomes the focus. And that's how Susan comes into Michelle's life, because after Sasha gets better, Michelle goes back to the hospital to thank the nurse, but also to criticize how if she didn't have the insurance she had, she would have possibly been waiting for hours and who knows how much longer, while her daughter possibly could have ended up dead because I think she had bacterial meningitis, which if you ever watched the show Switch That Birth, which is a really good show by the way, that's one of the reasons why Daphne, if I recall right, became deaf or hard of hearing. One of the two. So the last person we have to talk about is Betty, and what we see with Betty is just, it's kind of sad in a way, because you can see that Betty, she, as much as she adapted to the life of being a housewife and the wife of a congressional person, it doesn't seem like she was necessarily happy. The minds that she was dealing with in Alexandria, Virginia, just didn't seem to stimulate her unless she was pushing them to like open up their minds. And with how hesitant they were about how they could appear to others, it's a quick giggle for her, but after a while it's just annoying, and it really helps you understand why she's often drinking. But one of the reasons she's also drinking is because with her husband often away, she's stuck with three boys and one daughter, and while she does have help from a woman named Clara, is not a live-in maid or help. She goes home to her own family, which means, unfortunately for Betty, she's stuck with these rambunctious kids. The kind who really don't help around the house, so when the kids, I think it was a birthday party, some kind of party where she was making a cake or something in the oven, nobody's monitoring that. They just run into the house, do whatever. It gets all smoky for whatever reason. The windows are painted shut. So, Betty's trying to do all this while Jerry's on the phone, paying no mind to what's going on in the kitchen. She gets caught up, and apparently that's the start of her having a bit of a pill addiction, which, because of the times, they did not know that mixing pills and mixing alcohol is a very bad thing. And it gets so bad that it seems like either because of the pills and alcohol combination or just being overwhelmed by the kids, Betty has a little bit of a breakdown. And unfortunately, while you can see with Eleanor things got better in this episode, that is, and then with Michelle things got better, unfortunately, when it comes to Betty, you just see her kind of reminisce about the life she could have had if she stuck to dancing, and comparing that to the life she has now, where her life is pretty much dedicated to taking care of these kids, keeping up this home, while her husband gets to do all these great things, and she's just, waiting. And it's not even clear, at least the perception that I have of Betty right now is she's not even sure what she's waiting for besides, either for her husband to come back, for Claire to come around, or else just to go to bed. The highlight for me at this point is definitely Betty. I feel that Betty right now, she really has this underdog story that makes it so when it comes to Michelle and when it comes to Eleanor, as has been established, is privileged. She comes from money, multi-generation money, and that's what allowed her to go to school in England, where they have to speak French all day. It allows her to find these places in Greenwich Village where she talks to Hick, can be around lesbians without having to worry about the association, because, of course, if someone did make the rumor, her family could probably pay them off to shut the hell up. And then when it comes to Michelle, granted, Michelle's upbringing was not necessarily the best, since, money was tight, 2 kids, parents were working, but father had a disability. But after a certain point, she became privileged herself because she went to Princeton. Her brother was also doing well, if I recall right, and her parents pretty much were set. Yet, when you get to Betty, from what we're told, Betty's life was never with a silver spoon and a crystal staircase. She had issues with her mom. There's not much talk of her dad. She literally married somebody else just to get away with her mom, / as an act of rebellion. She tried to work into a store where she could become a buyer, to make more money and really firmly establish herself, but that didn't happen. She went to New York to become a dancer, and even though she was shown to have talent, apparently whatever insecurities or confidence she lacked, that made it so that her instructor said, "You're not the one, you can come back at another time," which, again, is something that you can't really do unless you have money, aka privilege, so back home she went. And I think, even though when it comes to Betty Ford in general, when it comes to this show, you don't really know much about her because her husband was a one-term president and he didn't even get to do a whole 4 years. I feel like that lack of knowing is what's really benefiting this character, since when you put that, not knowing her, and you also combine her being an underdog compared to the other two, it makes it so it's much more easier to get emotionally invested with this character and her journey, especially because in comparison to the other two, I feel like with Betty, they're using her younger version the best compared to what we see with Eleanor, where honestly it seems like they're just wasting that girl's talent. And then when it comes to the young Michelle, a part of me feels like those two don't necessarily complement each other, and not as a dig to Viola Davis's portrayal of Michelle, but more so it almost makes you feel that with the young Michelle, that's a whole story that could definitely be told, and focusing on the older Michelle, it's almost like a competition instead of a compliment. And I'm trying to think of this movie that really did it right, but it's not coming to me right now, but I'll probably put it where the subject of what I'm talking about is. When it comes to the on the fence portion, I think the main issue that we're kind of iffy about is just with an episode that's supposed to have been about the marital struggles, it didn't feel like it had the impact it was supposed to have. Like when it comes to Eleanor and Franklin, I feel like that was probably the best one because it shows that Eleanor, she was cheated on, forced to stay in this marriage, and yet when Sarah decided, you know what, I'm going to give up on my son, look at Eleanor still being there, and then once they get to the presidency, again, she gets dropped. She gets disappointed. She's set aside and pretty much left to build herself up all over again. With Betty, I would say hers is kind of iffy. For we don't really get to know Gerard Ford. He kind of just shows up, and when he does show up, he's pretty much nice and like a good husband, and he even seems like a decent father. And it's almost like Gerard Ford is a non-factor when it comes to this show. It's about Betty and all that she gave up, and you understanding she's far more than someone who was a housewife or someone who stood beside or behind her husband. Like, she had a whole life that she gave up to be part of his, and there might be some buyer's remorse there. Which leads us to Michelle. I think the struggle that this show is having is to show Michelle as a strong, independent individual while trying to avoid stereotypes, and also trying to hold Barack accountable for perhaps being someone who was so much about his community, so much about making change, that he wasn't fully there the way that Michelle needed him, either financially, in terms of helping to take care of the girls, or even to be a partner just to her. And with them being, to my knowledge, the only ones that are actually alive and could possibly criticize this show or maybe have an issue with it, it seems like the balancing act there is just still a bit of a struggle. For they don't know how much they should embellish, how much they should make assumptions, how maybe they should try to paint these people who are very much liked in America for the most part, and how to show them as individuals who have flaws, who have certain parts of them that aren't likable, yet at the same time acknowledge the fact that they made history together. And oftentimes I think the polling was that Michelle was far more liked than Barack. So overall, I think Betty Ford is probably going to be the one who benefits the most, or should I say Michelle Pfeiffer playing Betty Ford, since with her not playing someone who's as well known as the others, you can see with each episode her underdog stories quickly making her one of the people that you want to take notice of the most. And not just when it comes to Michelle Pfeiffer, but also the person who plays her younger counterpart. And as for Eleanor and Michelle, honestly, with each episode, Eleanor seems like she's starting to take a bit of a nosedive because of it's not as consistent as Betty's story. And with Michelle, she's kind of in the middle, but at the same time, it's in the middle in a seesaw way, where it's kind of like one episode you kind of like what's going on with Michelle's life, the other episode you kind of like, eh. But this is the first season for this show. It's not clear if they're going to do more of it. Plus, if you look at this show, it has each episode like almost half a dozen writers. So trying to figure out a way to have these three notable women in history have their stories all go well together and kind of mesh well, you have to give some grace.